Hello, welcome to Adult Story Time. This is going to be a drop on the roller coaster for all of us. So while I tag a few people and let them know I'm on board, grab you something to drink, get comfortable. This is going to be a long chapter and very, very detailed. I try to read each chapter before I read it to you. I usually give myself about 30 minutes to do it before our time. But today's chapter was so intense and a little longer that it took me a little longer to get through it. I tried to highlight and summarize a lot of it and edit out some of the stuff, but most of the stuff needs to be included so you can get a better understanding. This is the Harbinger. So while I tag a couple people, just make yourself comfortable and get you something to drink. All right, let's get started. For those that are joining us for the first time, I am so glad this is a rainy, stormy Saturday afternoon when most of us are inside anyway. So that's awesome. That works in our favor. This is a book called The Harbinger by Jonathan Cahn. For you all that are just joining us for the first time, we've been reading this book. Now this is the second week. We are going into chapter 17, the mystery of the Shemitah. It's a Jewish term, so you guys forgive my pronunciation of it. Shemitah. I asked you guys for homework. If you had a chance to look up the word Shemitah, and see what it means. Hopefully you did. It would give you a little bit understanding of what we're talking about. Jonathan's book. I'm going to read a little bit about Jonathan. In fact, I saw him on one of his TV shows this morning about 12 midnight on TBN, I think. He has a series that come on every night at midnight. So anyway, about Jonathan. Jonathan Cahn is known for opening up the deep mysteries of Scripture and for teaching of prophetic import. He leads Hope of the World Ministries, an international outreach of teaching, evangelism, and compassion projects for the needy. He also leads the Jerusalem Center Beth Israel, a worship center made up of Jews and Gentiles, people of all backgrounds, located in Wayne, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. He has ministered throughout the world and on television and radio. He is a Messianic Jewish believer, a Jewish follower of Jesus. For more information, for more messages and teaching from Jonathan, or to contact his ministry, write to Hope of the World, Box 1111, Lodi, New Jersey, 07644. You can also visit his website, get in touch, and get more online at www.theharbingerwebsite.com or www.hopeoftheworld.org. And Harbinger is spelled Harbinger. I'm going to read a little bit from the back of the book, Jonathan's summary of the book. Is it possible? Is it possible that there exists an ancient mystery that holds the secret of America's future? That this mystery is behind everything from 9/11 to the collapse of the global economy? That God is now sending a prophetic message on which America's future hangs? Before its end as a nation, there appeared in ancient Israel a series of specific omens and signs, warning of destruction. These same 9 harbingers are now manifesting in America with profound ramifications for America's future and end-time prophecy. Hidden in an ancient biblical verse from the book of Isaiah, the mysteries revealed in the Harbingers are so precise that they foretell recent American events down to the exact days. The 3,000-year-old mystery that revealed the exact date of the stock market collapse of 2008. The ancient prophecy that was proclaimed from the floor of the U.S. Senate and then came true, and more. The revelations are so specific that even the most hardened skeptic would find it hard to put down. Though it sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, it's real. Written in a riveting narrative style, The Harbinger opens with the appearance of a man burdened with a series of messages he has received in the form of 9 seals. Each unveils a prophetic mystery concerning America and its future that will take you on a amazing journey that will change the way you see the world forever. And I'm going to throw out a little hint for you guys that are into the stock market. This particular chapter can give you some insight as to the best time to sell and buy stock. So I'll drop that hint for those that are into the stock market. Okay, let's get started. Before we go into chapter 17, I'm going to read a little bit from the last paragraph of chapter 16, the uprooted, and transition us smoother into chapter 17. This next seal, Noriel, is going to open up a whole other realm of mystery. And it has to do with the second shaking. With the second and with the first, and with the second and with the first, and with that which joins the two together, as in the Isaiah 9 and 10 effect. Yes, but in this mystery, the connections are even more beyond the realm of the natural. They're supernatural. And they connect 9/11 to the economic collapse. Not only do they connect them, they determine them down to the time each one would take place. An ancient mystery. Yes, an ancient mystery upon which the global economy and every transaction within it was determined. A mystery that begins more than 3,000 years ago in the sands of the Middle Eastern desert. And now we will go into chapter 17. The mystery of the Shemitah. Several weeks later, as I was driving home from a conference out of the state through the countryside, it was a rolling landscape with fields of grain on both sides of the road. On my left, the grain sloped upwards to a distant crest. The wind was beating against the stalks, making waves throughout the field. I couldn't help looking at it while trying to keep my eyes on the road. A dance of wind, wheat, sunlight, and shadow. Then I noticed something out of place. I don't know what it was. At first I thought it was a scarecrow. Wow. It was the only thing I could think of. The figure of a man standing on top of the crest with a long, dark coat. It was him. Not that I could be sure from so far away, but I just knew it. So I pulled over to the side of the road, got up, and made my way through the field up to the crest. Noriel, he said, greeting me as I approached. What brings you to these parts? Oh, of course. What would bring me to these parts? I replied. And would it do any good if I asked you what you're doing standing in the middle of this field? I didn't think so. I'm here for the same reason you are, he said. So, he said, after a moment of silence, have you figured out the mystery of the seal? Something to do with the days of the week, I said. Why do you say that, he asked. Because there are 6 stalks of wheat, and I only knew about because you told me. The 6 were visible, the 7 was not. A pattern of 6 and 7, the same pattern of the biblical week. You didn't get it, he said, but you're on the right track. How so? Each stalk of wheat represents a measure of time. You got that right. But it's not a pattern of days. The same pattern given to Israel to mark their days was also given for their years. For 6 years they were to labor, sowing and reaping the fields, pruning their vines, gathering in their harvest. But in the 7th year they would rest. It would be the Sabbath year. The law of the 7th year came to them in the desert of Sinai through Moses. Thus they were commanded, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years shall you sow a field, and 6 years ye shall prune your vineyards and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. Each stalk represented a harvest. The missing stalk would stand for the 7th year. It's not there because the 7th year is the Sabbath year, so there's no harvest. Well done, he said. The 7th year was given a name. It was called the Shemitah. The word Shemitah means the release, the remission, the letting rest. In the year of the Shemitah, all laboring over the land was to come to a rest. There was to be no plowing, no sowing, no pruning, no reaping, no harvesting. The fruits of the harvest will be abandoned and let go. What grows of its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap nor gather the grapes of your untended vines, for it is a year of rest for the land. But how did they live without a harvest? They would eat whatever grew of itself. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. In the 7th year, each landowner was required to open up his land to those in need. The poor would share equally in the fruit of the rich. The land's produce would become, in a very real sense, the possession of all. But the Shemitah, he said, not only the fields, but also the people. The last remission took place in an entirely other realm. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release, Shemitah. Thus, the last letting go of the Shemitah would touch the economic realm and transform it. So in the 7th year, all debts were canceled. Everyone who had made a loan had to annul it. Those in debt were released. Anything still owed was forgiven. All credit was nullified, and all debt was wiped away. Wow. And all this took place at the end of the 7th year. Yes, at the very end of the specific day, the 9th day of the Hebrew month, Elul, the last day of the civil year, the very end of the 7th year. So the 29th of Elul was the climax, the focal point, and the finale of the Shemitah, the day when the nation's financial accounts were nullified. But wouldn't the canceling of all debts and nullifying of all credit cause an economic chaos? It could, he said, but most economists are dependent on some sort of system of credit and loans. So the economic repercussions of such a sweeping change would be immersed, so immersed that over the centuries, the rabbis would seek ways to get around the requirements in the fear that keeping them would cause economic disaster. But it was supposed to be a blessing, a Sabbath. Yes, a year of release and freedom, a year of rest from one's labors and of drawing near to God. And yet, in outward form, it could resemble an economic collapse. But if the Shemitah year was meant to be a blessing, what does it have to do with judgment, or Isaiah 9 and 10, or a miracle? The Shemitah would have been a blessing had Israel observed it and not rebelled against God. But Israel did rebel and didn't keep the Sabbath year. And the breaking of the Sabbath year became the sign of a nation that had ruled God out of his life. The nation had no more time for him. They were now serving others. The Sabbath years would be filled not with peace, but with the restless pursuit of increase and gain. The breaking of the Shemitah was a sign that the nation had driven God out of his fields, out of his labors, its government, its culture, its homes, and its life. The Shemitah was meant to be a blessing. And its breaking, its blessings turned into a curse. And what does that mean, I asked. The Shemitah will still come, said the prophet, but not by choice, but by judgment. Foreign armies would overrun the land, destroy the cities, ravage the fields, and take the people captive into exile. And the land would rest. The fields would become fallow. The buying and selling of its produce and flow of commerce would come to a standstill. Private ownership would become virtually meaningless. And every debt, credit, and loan would in an instant be wiped away. One way or the other, the Shemitah would come. And it would all be fulfilled centuries later when the armies of Babylon invaded and ravaged the land and took multitudes into captivity. The people would remain in exile for 70 years. Why 70? The answer was hidden in the mystery of the Shemitah. 70 was the number of Shabbat years not kept. But now, with the land lying still for 70 years, the law of the Shemitah will be fulfilled, even if not by choice. The timing of their judgment, 70 years for 70 Shemitah. So the Shemitah is meant to be a blessing, but for the nation that once knew God but has driven him from his life, the Shemitah becomes a sign of judgment. Correct, he said. So now let's piece the mystery together. In order to do that, we must first identify the pieces. I want you to record this. Write everything down that I tell you. You have a notepad? Yes. And a pen? Yes. You're a writer, Norel, so write. The effect and repercussions of the Shemitah extended to the financial realm, the economic realm, and the realm of labor, employment, production, consumption, and trade over the course of the 7th year. The nation's production is severely decreased as its fields and vineyards lay fallow. The nation's labor is greatly reduced or comes to a cessation. Its fields become, in part, the possession of all. The buying and selling of the land's produce is restricted. The fruits of labor are abandoned. Credit is canceled and debt is wiped away. For the nation that attempts to rule God out of its existence, the Shemitah changes from a vessel of blessing to a vessel of judgment, the judgment of a nation's prosperity. What does it have to do with America? America never had a Sabbath year. That's correct. It was only commanded for one nation. But the issue here isn't the literal observance of the Shemitah or any requirement to keep it. Then what is the issue here, I asked? The issue here, replied, is the dynamic, its effect, and its consequence. And what does that mean? The issue is the Shemitah as a sign. The Shemitah as a sign? The sign of the Shemitah given to a nation that has driven God out of its life and replaced him with idols and the pursuit of gain. The issue is the Shemitah as a sign of judgment, the sign that specifically touches a nation's financial and economic realms. I still don't know how it connects with America. Behind the collapse of Wall Street and the implosion of the American and world economy, behind all it lies the mystery of the Shemitah. Tell me. The economic collapse of 2008 was set off by a series of trigger events in September. At that time, about half of the American mortgage market was owned or backed up by two corporations, the Federal National Mortgage Association and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's right. And by early September, both of them, along with the mortgage and housing markets, were teetering on the edge of collapse. On September 7th, in one of the most dramatic economic interventions since the Great Depression, the federal government seized controls of both corporations, placing them under government censorship. In this effect, nationalizing them. Their seizure caused global alarm. And then, just as the market was reeling from their collapse, an even more economically cataclysmic collapse was about to take place. The fall of Lehman Brothers. At the start of the 21st century, Lehman Brothers stood at the pinnacle of the world's leading financial firms. But when the subprime mortgage market began to disintegrate, Lehman's standing and assets began to collapse. When the news spread that a deal to rescue the ailing firm had fallen through, its shares plunged along with the stock market. The following day, Lehman Brothers announced a loss of nearly $4 billion. The day after that, the firm's stock plunged another 40%, and news spread that it was seeking a corporate buyer. In the following days, a flurry of emergency meetings took place between the Federal Reserve and the leaders of Wall Street in a frantic effort to prevent Lehman's end. But the effort failed. And on Monday morning, September the 15th, 2008, 1 week after the collapse, came the second. And this time with no safety net to break the fall. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy in American history up to that date. It will be called the collapse heard around the world. The fall of Lehman Brothers would in turn trigger the collapse of Wall Street and the global financial implosion. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. But what does it all have to do with the mystery of the Shemitah? In the days of the prophet Jeremiah, with Jerusalem lying in ruins and the people taken away in captivity, the key that held the timing of the nation's judgment was hidden in the mystery of the Shemitah. So there's something in the timing of the economic collapse that's significant, huh? Yes. The collapse of Lehman Brothers and the American economy took place over the course of 1 week. It was the anniversary week of another American calamity, 9/11. Yes, the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae happened on September the 7th. The collapse of Lehman Brothers began 2 days later on September the 9th, when it lost 45% of its value. It was on September the 10th that it announced its loss of almost $4 billion, and the following day, its stock took a second precipitous plunge. September the 11th. It was that second collapse on September 11th that Lehman's death knell sounded throughout Wall Street and Washington, D.C. It was then that the Federal Reserve set in motion a series of actions and emergency meetings that would end in the fall of Lehman Brothers, triggering the implosion of the American and global economy. It was also on that September 11th that a second fall reached its critical mass, and a second alarm was sounded as the chief executive of AIG alerted the Federal Reserve of New York that his firm was likewise in critical danger of collapsing. Two alarms of the coming collapse, both sounded on September 11th. So as the nation was commemorating the calamity of 9/11, a second calamity, one that would ravage the economic realm, was just beginning. And the time separating the two events? 7 years, said the prophet. There were 7 years between the two. 7 years, the biblical period of time that concerns a nation's financial and economic realms. It concerns the judgment of those two realms. 7 years between the first and the second shaking. And what happens at the end of the 7 years? After 7 years comes the remission. At the end of every 7 years, you will have a release, a remission, a canceling of debts. So it was a remission of what exactly? Of credit and debt. And what did all these collapses have to do with credit and debt? I replied. So not only did the collapse of 2008 take place at the 7-year mark from 9/11, but it specifically concerned the principle of the Shemitah. The collapse of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, and Lehman Brothers all concerned the issue of credit and debt. In the case of the first two, the government intervened. It was a bailout. The two corporations were relieved of their debts over $5 trillion. A remission of debt. The remission of debt, said the prophet, whether temporary or permanent, is a form of Shemitah. And in the case of Lehman Brothers, the remission took on a different form. The government refused to bail out, and the corporation went bankrupt. And by declaring bankruptcy, its debts were wiped away and its loans were canceled. Another form of Shemitah, another remission of debt. So the American and the global financial collapse were triggered by the dynamic of Shemitah. Yes, and not only triggered by it. What do you mean, I asked? Stock markets are built on investment. Money is given on the assumption that investment will generate a return. In that sense, it follows the outward form of credit and debt. Beyond this, the investments come not only from individuals, but also from banking institutions, the funds on which represents loans, credit, and debt. But in the year of the Shemitah, credit and debt are nullified. Exactly. The fall of Lehman Brothers set off an avalanche of financial collapses from Wall Street to Asia. It will continue to cause the convulsion of stock markets around the world for several months, plunging them to ever new lows. Massive fortunes were wiped out overnight. The crashing of stock markets across the world meant the funds invested had vanished and would not be paid back, at least for the foreseeable future. Both credit and debt, trillions of dollars worth of credit and debt, had in effect been canceled. Every creditor who has made a loan to his neighbor will let it go, will cancel it. A Shemitah. How far back did it go, I asked. The cancellation of debt in the Shemitah, how far did it go back? Back to the end of the last Shemitah, he replied, to the last remission of debt. So the Shemitah will wipe away all the debts of the previous 7 years? Yes. And when the stock market crashed in September 2008, how much was wiped away? All the gains of the past 7 years and then some. And it touched the entire world. It touched the entire global economy in the form of collapsing markets, vanishing investments, government bailouts, corporate and personal bankruptcies, and foreclosures, each of which was in effect a financial nullification. So in each case, whether by bankruptcy, by aid, or by vanishing accounts, the burden was released. Each becomes a form of Shemitah. Not only each, he said, but all, the whole. The global economic collapse was itself one colossal made up of countless smaller ones. Does the Shemitah go back every 7 years into the past, I added, and into the future? It does, so he said. It can manifest once or many times. The point now is that the Shemitah as a sign of judgment. You spoke of a specific date when financial accounts had to be wiped clean, when credit and debt had to be nullified. The 29th day of Elul. The end of every 7 years. The Shemitah final and climactic day when all remaining loans, credits, and debts had to be nullified. So does the 29th of Elul have a part in the mystery, I asked? With the fall of Lehman Brothers, the stock market would plunge more than 499 points over the next several weeks. The world's financial markets reeled wildly from the impact. In response, the United States Congress worked frantically to come up with a plan to reverse the implosion. The result was a bill proposing the largest government bailout in American history. In a surprise turnaround of events that shocked the most observers, the bill was defeated. That morning, September 29th, New York Stock Exchange began its session with what many saw as an omen. The opening bell wouldn't sound. Oh my. I remember that. I remember when the bell didn't go off. When news reached the stock market that the rescue plan had been defeated, Wall Street collapsed. In a single day, it plunged more than 700 points. It was the crowning day in the first stage of the global collapse, and in terms of point loss, the worst day in the history of Wall Street. One financial analysis will sum up what happened on September 29th in this way. It was this event more than anything else that shattered market confidence. Over the next 2 weeks, the Dow fell close to 2,700 points, a decline of almost 25%. The damage had been done. The greatest single-day stock market crash in Wall Street history took place on the 29th day of Elul, the critical and crowning day of the Hebrew Shemitah. My God, I exclaimed. It was the only thing I could say. The day when financial accounts must be wiped away, when credit and debts are nullified, and it all happened on the exact biblical day on which it was ordained to happen. It's mind-boggling. The biggest crash in Wall Street history and the collapse of the global economy, all the manifestations of an ancient mystery. It's mind-boggling. Ooh. The greatest stock market point crash in Wall Street history took place on the last and crowning day of Shemitah. That evening, as the sun went down, it was the beginning of Tishri, the 7th month of the Hebrew year. What triggered the crash was rejection of the largest government bailout in American history, a sum of $700 billion. How much of the stock market was wiped away that day? 7%. Well, how many points did the 7% amount to? 777 points were wiped away that day. 777. On the final day of the 7th year. Do you realize, I asked, how many things would have to be in place for all this to happen? To come out like this? All of Wall Street, the entire American economy, the entire world economy, every transaction, every stock bought and sold, everything had to be in an exact position for it all to happen exactly as it did, at the exact time and the exact number. Who could have orchestrated all this? God, he replied. I guess he's the only one who could have. Everything I've told you thus far, Norel, concerns the end of the Sabbath year. But what about the beginning? Did anything happen to signal the beginning of the Shemitah? Good question, I said. It was a rare opportunity to say such a thing to the prophet. And so it does. The exact beginning and the end. The exact beginning and end. The years leading up to Shemitah were fat and prosperous. Buying, spending, investing, the stock market, the housing market, the credit markets, everything was booming. But as the Shemitah year drew closer, more and more signs of economic danger began to surface. The rate of loan failures and housing foreclosures began to rise. The financial institutions backing up those loans and mortgages now found themselves in crisis. But the first definitive sign of what was yet to come took place a year before the global economic collapse. It happened in Britain, but as a repercussion of the fall in American housing and credit market, in early September 2007, Northern Britain's 5th largest mortgage lender collapsed. It was the first British institution to suffer a bank run in over a century. By the end of the crisis, Northern Rock would be nationalized, the remission of debt. It was the first such collapse in the growing credit crisis and the foreshadow of the failures, the collapses, the interventions that would soon overtake the American and global economy of first Shemitah. The fall of Northern Rock happened on September 13, 2007. September 13, 2007 on the Hebrew calendar was the first day of the month of Tishri. The first day of Tishri is the day that begins the Shemitah year. So the first major sign of the Shemitah took place on the exact day on which the Shemitah begins. So then, the day of Northern Rocks falls to the day of the greatest stock market crash in history, should mark the beginning and the end of this biblical Shemitah. And so it does, says the prophet. The exact beginning and end. the exact beginning and end. Wow. Noriel, read back to me what you just took down. So I took out my notepad and began reading back the words of his dictation. The effect and repercussions of the Shemitah extended to the financial realm, the economic realm, and the realms of labor, employment, production, consumption, and trade. Thus said the prophet, the global crisis began in the financial realm, but didn't stop there. Before long, virtually every economic indicator and every major sector of the economy was affected. The crisis quickly spread into the realms of labor, commerce, production, consumption. Continue. Over the course of the 7 year, the nation's production is severely decreased as it fields and vineyards lay fallow. So the crisis, he said, causes industrial production to decline and in some cases to cease altogether as demand dries up. Downsize, factories cut back on output, businesses close their doors. The nation's labor is greatly reduced or comes to a cessation. So the crisis batters to labor force. Workers are laid off, unemployment skyrockets. Its fields become, in part, the possession of all. So private corporations are increasingly bought out, bailed out, and nationalized, or else become increasingly subject to the public realm. The buying and selling of the land's produce are restricted. So commerce and consumption suffer a massive decline. Consumers cut back on spending and sellers grow more desperate to find ways of reviving their sales. The fruits of labor are abandoned. So merchants sit untouched. Some merchandise sit untouched in stores and piles up in warehouses. The nations that rely mostly heavily on export trade now suffer extensive economic damage. Credit is canceled and debt is wiped away. And so, he said, the entire global collapse is a manifestation of the ancient mystery of the Shemitah. I have a question. Ask it. The stock market crash happened on the 29th of Elul, the last day of the 7th year. So that day was the end of a cycle of 7 Hebrew years. Correct, he said. So then there has to be another part to the mystery. That which takes place on the 29th of Elul would be the conclusion of something that began 7 years earlier. And so there should be something that took place 7 years before the crash. Something connected to it. Something that led up to it. Something that inaugurated the 7 year cycle. So, Noriel, how would you find out if such a thing exists? You'd have to count back 7 years from the crash, which would bring us to what? The year of 2001, to September of 2001, the month of 9/11, he said, finishing my thought. So then the 7 year cycle that reaches its conclusion in the global collapse would have had to have begun somewhere around the time of 9/11. It would go along with the Isaiah 9:10 effect. It was 9/11 and the nation's response to 9/11 that led to the economic collapse 7 years later. Good, Noriel. But you were looking for an event of the Shemitah. It would have to be a major event in the economic realm. And was there such an event? I asked. There was, he replied. What was it? It happened on Monday, September 17, 2001. It took place in the program, and it would match and would foreshadow what would happen 7 years later. And it was the greatest stock market point crash in Wall Street history up to that day. The record would remain intact for 7 years, 7 years into the crash of 2008. Take note, Noriel, of what we have. What do we have, I asked. A 7-year period that begins with a stock market crash and ends with a second stock market crash. We have a 7-year period framed by the two greatest stock market crashes in Wall Street history up to that time. A 7-year cycle beginning and concluding with two massive remissions of credit, which is what? The Shemitah, I answered. Correct. It happens at the same time as the first and second shaking. And the mystery goes deeper still, he said. What do you think it was, Noriel, that caused the stock market crash of September 17, 2001? What, I asked. It was 9/11. It was 9/11 that caused the New York Stock Exchange to close down for 6 days. And then when it reopened the following Monday to suffer the greatest loss in its history up to that date. The crash of September 17, 2001 was the aftershock of 9/11. Just as the crash of 2008, also the aftershock of 9/11. The extended aftershock, the Isaiah 9:10 effect. So each year was an aftershock of 9/11, two shakings, and there comes a second. And the two events were inextricably bound together, 7 years apart. This too goes deeper still. The biblical year isn't based on the Western Georgian calendar, but on the Hebrew lunar calendar. So the 7-year cycle of the Shemitah has to be based not on the Western year, but on the biblical Hebrew year. So no matter what date it is on the Western calendar, the Shemitah will always end on the 29th day of Elul on the Hebrew calendar, which in the year 2008 fell on September 29th, the day of the crash. But in other years, the same day in the biblical calendar will fall on a different date in the Western calendar. And so what happened if we go back 7 years from the greatest stock market crash in history? Back to the other great stock market crash in history, the crash of 2001, the one directly triggered by 9/11. On that day, did it fall on the biblical Hebrew calendar? Tell me. On the 29th day of Elul, it all happened on the 29th day of Elul, the exact same day. The one day of the biblical calendar ordained from ancient times to cause the wiping away of credit and debt. My God, both of them? Both of them, he answered. September the 17th. That came up before. What was on that date? The Isaiah 9:10 effect. That was it. The interest rates, September 17, was the day the Federal Reserve slashed the nation's interest rate. It was the beginning of the extreme post-9/11 suppression of interest rate, the first concrete act of defiance in the face of 9/11, and that which would lead to the economic collapse 7 years later. That would mean that the Isaiah 9:10 effect began on the day of the Shemitah. It would mean that it was on the day of the first stock market collapse in 2001 that the seeds were sown for the second. Shemitah leads up to the next, and the first calamity leads to the second. But there's only one Elul 29 that can close the 7-year cycle. Only one could be the actual day of remission, the one that comes around only once every 7 years. So on which Elul 29 did the stock market crash of 2008 take place? It was the one. The crash of 2008 took place on that precise 29th of Elul that comes around once every 7 years. On the one and only day that comes around once every 7 years. Incredible. Whew. It means that the other crash, the one that happened 7 years earlier, the one set off by 9/11, the other greatest stock market crash in the history, also took place on that exact 29th day of Elul. That comes around only once every 7 years. So then the two greatest Wall Street stock market crashes not only happened on the same day on the biblical calendar, but on the one day of the biblical calendar ordained to wipe out credit and debt, but each one fell 7 years apart on the exact one in every 7 year occurrence of that one Hebrew day. It's beyond amazing. Ooh. I asked the prophet, was the biblical Shemitah still observed? He said it was in a ritualistic form. Then was the ritual Shemitah taking place on the day of the crash, I asked? It was, he answered. As religious Jews were observing the conclusion of the Shemitah, closing the 7th year in the ritual acts, symbolically wiping away their debts and credits, on the same day, the force of a more mysterious Shemitah was operating, causing Wall Street to collapse and astronomical sums of credit and debt to be wiped away, not in symbol, but in reality. But the mystery of the Shemitah could not have been manifested if 9/11 had never happened. And just when it did, at that exact time, without 9/11, the stock market would never have crashed on the 29th of Elul. So 9/11 had to be woven into the mystery of the Shemitah. It had to be, he said, and it was. Oh. And one more thing to know, he said, turning to me, and he looked directly in my eyes. The Hebrew word Shemitah has one other meaning, which is the fall or the letting fall, as in collapse. So you could translate Shemitah as the year of the fall or the year of the letting fall. And that's the mystery of what happened, isn't it? Yes, behind everything. The fall of the stock market, the fall of the housing market and credit market, the fall of the commerce and business and trade. Everything fell. Every bankruptcy, every foreclosure, every financial failure, every plunge of every major economic indicator, the global collapse itself, everything was a fall. And the entire global collapse began with the fall of the Lehman Brothers, which was not only a fall, I said, it was a letting fall. The Federal Reserve decided to let it fall. Yes. So the entire global collapse began with the American government performing an act of Shemitah. And it goes deeper still. How? No human hands could have orchestrated the countless actions, reactions, and transactions required to cause Wall Street and the global economy to collapse and for everything to happen just as it did at the exact time ordained in the ancient mystery. Then by the hands of God, said the prophet, it was his Shemitah, it was his letting fall. His letting fall of the American economic world order. With the collapse of the global economy, new challenges to American power and leadership would be unleashed, a foreshadowing of the ultimate end of the American-led global order. And all triggered by 9/11, I said. And all a prophetic message, he replied, just as it was in the days of the prophet Jeremiah, as he gazed out at the land devastated, devoid of its fruit and harvest, as he phantomed the sign of the Shemitah, the sign given to the nation that has forgotten the foundations, placed its trust in its powers and prosperity, and ruled God out of his life. And now it appears again, as a sign to another nation that has likewise ruled God out of his life, a sign to give warning to that nation that apart from his presence, its blessings must turn into curse, and its prosperity must become its judgment. We stopped speaking and just stood there, watching the wind sweep over the fields. It had to have been a good 2 minutes before the silence was broken by the prophet with a question. Are you ready, Norrell? Ready. For the next mystery? I don't know. I'm still trying to absorb this one. It's a lot to take in. You have the seal? Yes. So I turned it to him. I returned it to him. And he said in turn, and he in turn handed me another. Are you sure you meant to give this one to me? I asked. Why? It's the scroll. It is. You've already given it to me 2 times before. And now a third. It's the prophecy, Isaiah 9 and 10. I said. So what am I supposed to see in it that I haven't already seen before? Nothing, he said. What do you mean? It's not in the seal. It's in the giving. I don't understand. How many times have I given it to you now? 3 times. So there comes a third. A third what? A third witness. And that concludes our long chapter 17. The mystery of the Shemitah. It was a roller coaster ride. Thank you for joining me this Saturday afternoon for Adult Story Time Harbinger. I've enjoyed spending this time with you, and I look forward to tomorrow at 5 o'clock to resume our chapter 18, the third witness. And before we adjourn, we always say a prayer. I'll lead you in the sinner's prayer in case there's anyone with us that do not know Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. And for those of us that already have accepted Him into our lives, it's a rededication. And just like telling a loved one you love them, you can never do it too much. So let's bow our heads. Dear Jesus, I believe that you are the Son of God and that you came into this dark world over 2,000 years ago and died a horrible death on a cross. Not because you were guilty, because you are perfect, but because I was guilty. I am guilty. And the penalty for my sins is death. But you so loved the world and me that you came into this world and you died on that cross and you took the penalty for my sin. Jesus, I ask you to forgive me for all my sins and accept me into your family. I will spend the rest of my life doing not my own will, but your will, according to what your word says. Thank you, Jesus, for the free gift of salvation. Thank you for accepting me into your family. In Jesus' name, amen. Welcome to the family. And for you all that are already part of the family, thanks for rededication, saying a prayer of rededication with me. We love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I look forward to story time tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Bye-bye.